You may be really curious why it is that I spent so much time establishing the framework. Well, I think context is so important. Jesus doesn't just show up out of the blue. He shows up into a well-established community, and a community that has been going through a lot of changes, and they've had dramatic and traumatic things that have happened. And so given everything that we have just covered in the earlier part of this course, only now do I think that it is proper for us to get into what happened when Jesus was born. So his own context, his own birth narrative. And now you're equipped with a new set of lenses to maybe re-look at a very familiar narrative to you, but potentially in a new way. So let's see if there are different things that we can come up with. Now, when I am working with groups of people, I very often will ask them, in just a few sentences, explain to me the birth narrative. And almost always, the scene that is painted for me is something that you see here. I mean, this kind of image on the screen is what you see often on Christmas cards during Advent, right before Christmas, right? So people always say, Mary and Joseph are a very young couple. Mary is pregnant, usually 9 months pregnant. She's bursting at the seams practically. She's riding on a donkey to Bethlehem. And when they get there, there's all these evil innkeepers who slam doors in their faces and won't let them give them any kind of lodging place. One innkeeper has compassion and puts them out in an A-framed style barn. The donkey's there, sheep are there, the wise men, there's always 3 wise men. Have you ever wondered about that? But 3 wise men who come and show up. And it's a very peaceful scene. It's a very quiet scene. It's a very sacred scene, and no one else is there. Well, let's look at that imagery a little bit closer. Let's take another look, and I'm going to focus on the birth narrative that is in Luke, although Matthew also gives us a birth narrative. But I'm choosing Luke because there's a lot more geography, earthiness in Luke's story that I want to point out to you. So in Luke chapter 2, we get a very familiar story, and it starts out with this. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. While they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth. Now, in these verses, let me ask you, where is the donkey? The donkey, which is pictured in every nativity scene I've seen, and in almost every picture, the donkey is not mentioned. In fact, I would suggest that the donkey never did exist in this particular story, because much later on, when Mary and Joseph take Jesus into Jerusalem, into the temple, to be circumcised, and they offer as a sacrifice 2 dove offerings. That is the offering that people who are poor offer if they do not have the finances to offer a sheep. And so if they are too poor to offer the normal offering of the firstborn child, they are probably too poor to have a donkey to travel on. So let's just take the donkey part out of the scene. Okay, how pregnant is Mary? Well, it's interesting because this distance that they had to travel, and again, this is as the crow flies, so without taking into account the ups and downs of the hills, the direct line for, like, through the air from Nazareth, which is up here, down to Bethlehem, which is in the south down here, that is 113 kilometers. Or 70 miles. So that is quite far if you have to travel on foot. They may have been traveling with other people. There's a lot of things here that we just don't know. If it was just the two of them, most likely with other people. It is unlikely that they went through the area of Samaria. So they probably even traveled this way down into the Rift Valley, along the Jordan River, crossed over at Jericho up to Jerusalem, and then down to Bethlehem, which would have added even more time to their journey. So we don't actually know. I mean, we have to kind of guess based on how we know that people traveled, but it's unlikely they went through Samaria, and most likely they went this direction. Would they have chosen to do this journey at the most precarious time of her pregnancy, when pregnancy in and of itself is already extremely dangerous in this time period? There were a lot of women and a lot of babies that died through this act of giving birth. So it's extremely unlikely that Joseph would have chosen to travel at this particular time. So they travel, and let's go back to the text in Luke, because it says, while they were there. In other words, we don't know how long they had been in Bethlehem prior to the days being completed for her to give birth. So what we do know is Mary and Joseph travel quite a long distance to get to Bethlehem. Why Bethlehem? Well, that is where Joseph's ancestors are from. Now, this is another good thing for us to also point out, is depending on where you live and what kind of culture you are from, in the West, which is where I'm from, and we're a lot more individualistic, and we don't pay as much attention to our ancestry. We tend to be much more forward looking. We also, because of the way technology has developed, we are not as mindful of what small agrarian villages how they would have acted. But Bethlehem was a small village. And so we have to put our mind back into the cultural context of Bethlehem at this time. So they would have had a long understanding of ancestry, of how they were connected based on family name and their ancestry, and they would have highly valued that. So with Joseph arriving into town, into Bethlehem, and he has to be there to register for a tax, which is a whole other really interesting subject we're not going to get into, but go through all of the different journal articles that IBC has to offer to see if you can uncover some interesting facts about that, the census that was being taken. But Joseph comes into Bethlehem, and it being a small village, he could have said, I am Joseph, son of so and so, and I belong here, like my ancestors are from here. People would have embraced them and welcomed them, even if he was traveling with Mary, who is pregnant. So there's still the idea of hospitality that trumps a lot of the village way of life. Now, they come into town. We can suppose that this small village is being flooded with a lot of other relatives who are all needing to come to Bethlehem to register for this tax. And so where would Mary and Joseph have gone? Well, they would have gone into one of the homes of the relative of Joseph. That is how the ancient village culture worked. And so hold on to that for a second. Don't jump ahead just yet. While they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth. And then what does Luke say? Because this part is also interesting. She gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in cloth, laid him in a manger, which actually would have been like a stone square carved out in the middle. So laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the Kataluma. Now, most Bible translations in English, they take that Greek word Kataluma and they translate it as inn, which it can, it can mean in, but it gives us in modern day the incorrect image in our mind. So it is true during this time, during the Roman Empire, that the Romans did set up inns along primary Roman roads to act as like a way station for travelers. And so we get stories like the Good Samaritan, the parable that Jesus tells later, where the Samaritan takes the man who's been wounded back down to Jericho and pays like an innkeeper. But that is a different word than Kataluma. Kataluma actually means guest room. And in fact, if we look at how many times the word Kataluma has been used in the Gospel of Luke, it's used twice. So the other time it's used is towards the end of Luke when Jesus celebrates the Last Supper with his disciples, and he's giving the disciples instructions for going to set up the meal. And he says, you will find a man who's carrying a jug of water, follow him, and then set up this feast in the Kataluma, which is not in this man's inn, but in that man's guest room. Now, in a lot of English translations, this word Kataluma is almost always translated guest room at the end of the Gospel of Luke, but is almost always translated as in Luke chapter 2, but it is the same word. Now, how should we really understand Kataluma? Well, again, we need to understand architecture and this ancient context.